Well, I would like to welcome Pauline Boss to my podcast. Dr. Pauline Boss is a very well-respected and honored figure in the field of sociology and family therapy and psychology. She's an educator and a researcher who's widely recognized for her groundbreaking research on what is known as the theory of ambiguous loss, which is a very important concept in terms of my area of interest, which is working with families who are going through family estrangement. For over 30 years, her work has focused on connecting family science and sociology with family therapy and psychology. And she's developed theories to guide theory that guides practice. She is currently an emeritus professor at the University of Minnesota and was visiting professor at Harvard Medical School, 1995 to 1996, and Hunter School of Social Work, 2004 and 2005. Professor Boss has worked with families in New York who lost family members during 9/11 and families in Kosovo who've also lost family members as a result of ethnic cleansing and terrorism. She's also worked with families who have psychologically lost a relative as a result of Alzheimer's disease and other kinds of chronic mental illness. Welcome, Pauline. Nice to see you again. I don't know if you recall, you and I met about 22 years ago at my first.
I remember.
You remember? Okay, it was a long time ago, and it was just a one-time meeting. But I was so happy to be able to meet you. So grateful to have you here.
It's nice to come circle around again. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming. So as I mentioned, my interest in your topic has to do with the working with estranged parents. So many, it's really become the basis of my private practice, working with parents whose adult children have no contact with them, very little contact with them. Many of these parents were very involved as grandparents prior to the estrangement. And I think that ambiguous loss is such a rich and useful concept for families going through estrangement on all sides of estrangement. Is it, the estranged adult children can also feel ambiguous loss as can the grandchildren. But so for our listeners who aren't familiar with it, with the concept, Pauline, can you kind of describe it and define it for the thousandth time? I'm sure you've.
Well, ambiguous loss is simply an unclear loss. And it causes a great deal of uncertainty, which then is very stressful for the people who experience it. There are two kinds of ambiguous loss. One is physical, where the person is physically missing, but psychologically absent because the people don't know their whereabouts and whether they're dead or alive or ill or whatever. So that's the first kind of ambiguous loss that I studied, and that was with the families of soldiers missing in action in Vietnam.
Wow.
The second kind of ambiguous loss is where the person is there, but gone nevertheless. And so I call that psychological ambiguous loss. For example, from dementia, where the person is in front of you, physically present, but they no longer know who you are. And it could also be addiction, and it could also be many other kinds of serious mental illness and so on. Many families experience both types at the same time. And certainly estrangement is another one that is, I'm sorry to say, I understand, increasing today.
Seems to be.
And so, yes, it is relevant to that. It is relevant. It is an ambiguous loss.
Yeah. Well, I like what you said about it being stressful to not be able to kind of name it or kind of formalize it as an experience. Can you say more about that? Why is it important for us to have specific labels for our experiences?
Well, I'll preface that by saying I'm coming from a stress perspective, not a medical perspective.
Sure.
I'm a family therapist, but I believe that we have pathologized a lot of loss that can be understood through the stress model. But as we know from Stress 101, you can't cope with something unless you know what it is. And so I just simply gave a name to a kind of loss that had been ignored. I couldn't find any reference to it in history, although Freud did have a footnote about it.
Mm.
but nothing more, and never mentioned again. So what we're doing here is giving a name to something people are experiencing so they can begin to cope with it once they have seen it. I'd say something else about that name. As opposed to a name like mental illness, a medical diagnosis or syndrome, it is an innocuous name. In fact, it's a rather poetic name.
I agree.
And so people accept it rather readily, even children. And there seems to be no resistance to that name, where there is resistance to saying, for example, someone who's grieving, you have this DSM diagnosis. And of course, then they feel bad because they now have some quality in themselves that has failed. Underneath all of this, and I think I read that in your book as well, I think we pathologize too much of human behavior.
Mm. No, I think that's very well said, and I love your the concept that ambiguous loss is non-pathologizing. It's very incorporative of so many different kinds of experiences.
Yes.
I loved in your new book, The Myth of Closure, which I want to ask you about. You kind of frame all of these different kinds of experiences as forms of ambiguous loss, and I just love that you were able to kind of show and illustrate all these forms of loss that we don't really have names for. And I think in giving them names, it allows a kind of a credibility to those people who are experiencing that, and a kind of a validation of their experience that I think is really profound and important. So you mentioned, for example, slavery or the inheritance of slavery or other kind of forms of social injustice. I was thinking about the changing forms of childhood, that my children and grandchildren can't have the same kind of childhood that I had, which was very kind of unburdened and outside and free from all the constraints of worrying.
You too.
Yeah, which was great. And that's a kind of it's an ambiguous loss that they don't even know about, but it's something that
That's right.
loss for them. But and you've written also about in The Myth of Closure about, which is a great book and a very useful book, about COVID and as a form of ambiguous loss. Can you say more about that?
Well, when the pandemic hit 2 years ago, my goodness, we didn't know what it was. We couldn't see it. It was an invisible enemy. At that point, even the scientists and the medical people were in the dark. And as a result, there was a great deal of uncertainty. Ambiguous loss leads to an uncertainty that is immensely stressful. People didn't know what to do. And when directions came out about how to stay safe, perhaps because the stressor was ambiguous, some people said, no, that's not it. It's a hoax. And I'm not going to listen to any of this. Get vaccinated or wear a mask. So when there is ambiguous loss, you almost always, I almost predict it, I predict it and tell therapists to intervene immediately, that the family will argue about what the ambiguous loss means. Well, now we're talking about the family of the country and the family of the globe, the family of our community. It's still systems theory, isn't it? It's still systemic thinking about relationships. And when there's a situation that's unclear, any theory will do, you see. And we have seen evidence of that. And that produces conflict.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, that ambiguity in and of itself is highly stressful. And we know from sociology research on ambivalence in families that people will often choose much more of a polar perspective in order to avoid those feelings of ambivalence. So you in The Myth of Closure talk about,
exactly.
Yeah, you in The Myth of Closure talk about ambivalence as in some ways an important thing to accept and reconcile and embrace. That in some ways our ambivalent feelings towards other people we love, life in general, is just part and parcel of being human. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I actually see, I do write about ambivalence as an outcome of ambiguity. I mean, why wouldn't it result from that? It's a natural outcome of ambiguity. But I'm not talking about psychiatric ambivalence, which is in the mental illness, in the more medical model. I'm talking about sociological ambivalence. Merton and Barber, way back when, young people, I don't think, read them anymore, but they brought this up, and I give them credit for it, that you can have ambivalent behaviors as a result of the social context around you. Well, that's what we're having now. The social context around us is pathological. It's got a virus in it. And so we react with ambivalence. I need to do what I'm told, and I don't want to do what I'm told. I'm both terrified, and I can also do something to lessen the danger. So we're surrounded by that kind of thinking, primarily due to a danger in the outside environment, which is real.
Right. So that increases intense feelings of anxiety, and people are in search of some degree of certainty, and that can lead them to make decisions that aren't necessarily in their best interest.
And that's where closure comes in. Now,
Right.
when you say it doesn't exist, it's a hoax, that's closure. It's an artificial closure that, of course, can get you killed, but it is one that people grasp for. In fact, we would like to do that by saying, oh dear, it isn't so dangerous. We can go to this ball game.
Right.
So I understand it. I understand that ambiguity does strange things to our behavior, but I know that in general, it causes great stress.
No, I think it's absolutely true. So can you tell us more, when you say the myth of closure, what is the myth of closure?
Well, the myth of closure is the title I chose. I've been working on this for a long time. It came out of my work with Ambiguous Loss, where I, at first in my early writings, write that it's painful for people because there is no closure. I now think that was a mistake to say it that way, because I don't think closure is desired in any case, even with a clear-cut death. We now know the grief literature for ordinary death says that we can live with the grief of that kind of loss. We do not have to get over it, but we need to find some meaning in it and some purpose in it. I certainly saw that with families that had ambiguous loss, which I consider a huge mountain to climb, to find meaning in that kind of loss where someone disappears either in body or mind. But if they could do it, I thought that people with a clear-cut death could do it as well. And so I wrote about the myth of closure as not that closure is not possible nor needed. And I examined our sages from the past in the grief literature, Freud, Kubler-Ross, for example. In their personal writings, they show us that they didn't have closure either. When Freud saw a patient after his daughter died from the flu in 1918, the patient said, "I'm so sorry about your daughter's death." And he patted his vest pocket and said, "She's right here." I've written about that more precisely, which means that he had some sort of memento of her in his pocket, in his locket somewhere. So, and Kubler-Ross, before she died, and of course it took her a long time. Before that, she was paralyzed from strokes for about 9 years. She essentially gave up on the 5 stages of death, which she had meant for the dying, by the way. And she said she couldn't get off the runway. She was stuck on the runway and for 9 years, and she was quite angry about that. And she said, it's messy, it's not in linear stages. So that too reminded me that even the process of dying and taking and remembering the people who have died. The closure is a myth. It was a myth in our original teachers. It's a myth now. It's a myth that may be, according to the sociologist that wrote the book on closure, I'm blanking on her name right now, but the title of the book is Closure. She essentially says that the myth is kept alive by business people who want to make money off of the grief of people by saying, you know, here is something you can wear, you can keep the ashes in a locket and so on. But that all is costly. So I think what we need to remember is that it's okay to think about the person who is lost or gone. It's normal, and it's normal grieving. And whether the person is dead or alive, if they're gone, you miss them. And you may, in some cases, be sad about it. Like the group you work with, I surely would be sad if I couldn't see my grandchildren, or I surely would be sad if I couldn't see my children, even though some of them live farther away, so it makes it a little harder. But you never feel like it's a cutoff. Closure is a myth, and unfortunately today, we are having artificial closures, alienation, ghosting, those kinds of things that are artificial, and they'll come back to bite you.
Well said. So what would you say to these estranged parents in my practice? Because in some ways, I mean, death is an enormous loss, and it's hard to compare any kind of loss and say, well, that loss is easier than this loss. But I think part of what estranged parents struggle with is not only the loss, but the feelings of rejection, shame, humiliation, really the loss of a role. And so I think part of what makes it hard for estranged parents to kind of reckon with it is, and I think ambiguous loss is useful because it gives it a name, but I think it's hard for them to, it's all the other feelings that get attached to it, the shame, the loss, the humiliation, the feelings of rejection. So do you have thoughts about what kind of a way to frame those experiences for them, since you have such deep experience in helping people who are suffering a variety of forms of loss?
I don't do therapy anymore since my husband became very ill. But I, before that time, had worked with quite a few cases of alienation. And mostly it was the older generation who came to see me. The first thing I told them, this will take a while. And I'm not sure it can ever be solved.
Yeah.
But think in terms of 5 years, not 1 year. And it will also take work on your part. That is, if change is to happen, we only have control only changing ourselves.
Right.
And so one way to begin is to, after hearing the story, is to work on oneself, to make oneself, what can I say, more appealing to the younger generation to come back. And it also requires an acknowledgement of your own weaknesses or acknowledgement of what you might have done that was wrong without guilt. I mean, I think guilt will probably be normal in there. I meant to say without shame, because shame is the harder one. Shame is the problem because it has to do with self-esteem and self-loathing, and therefore you need to move it from shame to ordinary guilt, which, by the way, we've all got it. We've all been imperfect parents.
Right.
And we've been imperfect children of our parents.
Right.
So I would try to normalize guilt, but not shame, and empower the people to change themselves. And then eventually, perhaps, as you write so well, there are ways to reconnect, first perhaps by writing and so on. And that needs to be done very carefully And you have certainly provided a roadmap for that. But essentially what it means is, as my mother used to say, sweep in front of your own doorstep first, before you try to sweep in other people's doorsteps. We can't tell our kids what to do, but we can be in charge of what we do and make ourselves the kind of person they would like to visit with, or they would like their children to spend time with.
I think that's well said. And yeah, I think it acknowledges how much the family life has changed, that today nothing compels an adult children to have a relationship with a parent beyond that adult child wanting to. So it gives the adult child much more power, and it diminishes the power of the parent. So to your point, the parent has to be able to speak to the adult child's complaints, take responsibility, try to heal the distance, try to see it from the adult child's perspective, and that kind of thing. So getting back to the closure concept, that one of the things that I like about the concept of radical acceptance is that it accepts that there's not closure. With radical acceptance, there's the idea that you can, that things are terrible, that you may not see your child again or your grandchildren again. You may just have to accept that. But to your point, life can still have meaning and value. And I think if we're so oriented towards closure, it can really direct us in down the wrong path. Whereas if we just accept that certain things are beyond our control, terrible things can happen to us. I know, Pauline, that you lost a husband recently, which I can't imagine the loss of somebody that you loved and been with for so many years. And it's not, what could possibly be the closure in that? So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I might sound like a grandmother now, but I think we jumped to closure way too soon, including the medical community, including the psychological professionals. I think it's very essential to work on a relationship rather than say you shouldn't see them anymore. Now, I would like to tell you right now that I'm not talking about abusive or incestuous relationships, okay? But I'm talking about all the others, and we're jumping way too fast to saying don't see them anymore.
I agree.
But our friend Stephanie Kuntz has written about the fact that historically, while families were units that stayed together whether you liked them or not, because it was survival, today we have a happiness idea. And frankly, I want to say, get over it. You know, you can be happy some days, but they won't always be happy. And yes, you will have connections with people you don't like. So I'm saying you don't need to like your family. But maintaining a connection, even if you stay in a hotel as opposed to in the house when you come back home, or if you just telephone, or if you just write or email or whatever it is, some minimum connection, or have lunch once a year with at least one person in the family that you are connected to. All of this, I think, is better than a complete closure, as if the family is dead to you. I think that's a coward's way out, by the way. And unfortunately is supported by some professionals. And I think rather you should do the work. And that way everybody grows from it. It's a win-win, both for the people who don't want to talk to you before this or yourself. It's a win-win. You may never be friends. You may never love them in the way that, Leave It to Beaver families looked like. But at least you will have a connection that took some maturity and some psychological work to someone that is less than perfect. By the way, that's true for life. Our bosses are less than perfect quite often. Our fellow workers are less than perfect. And by the way, if you're looking for the mate who is perfect, you'll probably never find one.
That's for sure. Yeah.
So I think our focus on happiness has gone overboard, and therefore has increased this culture of closure, this culture of cutoff, of saying, you no longer exist for me.
Mhm.
It's very dangerous if we're going that direction.
No, I think that's beautifully said. We have this huge mental health crisis in our country. We have towering rates of loneliness and atomization and social isolation. And part of it is that everybody's kind of pursuing their own individual ideas of happiness. And to your point, my field of psychology and psychotherapy does in some ways enormous harm by supporting these ideas that the most important thing is your pursuit of your own individuality and happiness and self-growth. And if anybody or anything stands in the way, then you should just cut them off. And that's somehow an act of existential courage. And I think that's highly problematic. And it gets sort of linked to this idea of mental health, that today the pursuit of mental health is considered the most sort of, glamorous, positive, courageous thing to do. Well, I'm cutting out that person because they're bad for my mental health. Well, it may be that person you're cutting out, was a great grandmother or great grandfather, and your grandchildren adore that person. Or you're basically ruining your parents' life in your pursuit of your mental health. And so, kind of to your point, Pauline, things don't have to be either or. They can be
Right.
both
Both
and.
and.
You can hate your parents and still love them or still find value in them,
Yes.
And so the idea of just cutting off and getting rid of people and in many ways ruining their lives, which is what so many of these estranged parents and grandparents feel, to me, that's sort of a moral problem in our culture.
I agree with you. And it may be related to our focus on the individual.
Yeah.
We, more than any other country in the world, focus on the individual. And I think that's a dangerous path if it becomes exclusive.
Yeah.
You need the both and. You need both to take care of yourself as an individual, but you also need to be part of a human system, or loneliness will become the biggest issue in our culture. And the bigger system is full of imperfections. And people who we don't really want to be friends with, but they're part of our bigger system.
Right.
I think psychotherapy has got to get off the individualistic dime and take into consideration the context in which people live, which is with other human beings. Very few of us are hermits. And right now, much of psychotherapy is being given as if the person is a hermit. And if you don't like what's around you, you just cut it off. I think that's very dangerous.
No, I agree. I think it's very problematic. And I think the way that you're contextualizing it in terms of family, we're not only part of a system of a family, we're also part of a system of a larger culture. And so this atomization that we're currently experiencing is just causing so much division and harm and depression and anxiety.
Right.
It's problematic. Well, yeah, so speaking of cultures, Pauline, are there cultures that you think do a better job of managing loss? It seems to me that one of the problems in the American culture is that we sort of don't have much in the way of ritual. We're very much of a materialist culture, and it seems like other societies do a much better job of having rituals that help us manage these. Is this what you've looked into? I know you talked a little bit about it in the myth of closure.
Yes, Eastern cultures, for example, have ancestor worship. The Thai restaurant down the street from where I live put a meal in the window each day for their ancestors. And I've worked with the people in Fukushima since that disaster of the tsunami and the atomic plant failing. Many of them have ways of coping that we haven't even considered. And one would be if a baby was washed away out of their mother's arm, she might say, there's a kind woman on another island looking after my baby. And, in my training, it would have said, that's a problem. We need to get her to see the truth. Yeah. I never interfere when someone says something like that to me. And there's a telephone booth that survived the tsunami, even though it's a little tipped, where people go in today and call their missing loved ones. Even children do. Wow. And no one there criticizes that. or
Mhm.
thinks it's a hallucination or whatever pathology we would call it.
Yeah.
My feeling is, and I've learned this from the Eastern cultures primarily, is that we need more tolerance for creative ways of coping with loss.
Mhm.
And of course, there's a line beyond which you shouldn't go. If you're suicidal, if you're wanting so much retribution that you're going to kill somebody else who caused your loss, that kind of self-endangerment or endangerment of others, of course, needs to be addressed.
Mhm.
But other than that, there are many different ways to find resilience and coping. And here, in the way we've been trained, it's quite narrow.
Yeah.
Uh, and and so we need to learn from the people around us. The Native Americans here, for example, in Minnesota, taught me that they believe in harmony with nature, not always trying to conquer it, but that they also believe in science and medicines and so on. So they do the both and, which I think more of us need to do.
Yeah.
And certainly in Western cultures like our own, like New York after 9/11, which is a very mastery-oriented city,
Mhm.
most people said, why can't the families of the missing see their loved ones are dead in that smoking pile, lower Manhattan? And I said, precisely because they can't see. They can't see it.
Mhm.
And therefore, it's an ambiguous loss. And by the way, for at least half of them, or nearly half of them, they still do not have DNA evidence.
Yeah. So
But
hard.
I'm hoping that we were able to plant the idea amongst the New York's terrific body of clinicians
Mhm.
that you do not use grief therapy with ambiguous loss. They will get angry at you and walk out, which is exactly what people did.
And why is that? Why was the grief therapy so incompatible with what they were going through?
Well, the grief therapy, as the way we've been taught it, assumes a death. And it comes out in how you approach it.
Mhm.
You know, how do you need to acknowledge the death? Well, they're not going to do that. And they actually would say in the few days after, I saw him walking up the walk at 5 o'clock like he always did. And so they would automatically pathologize that.
I see.
So instead of the medical base for grief therapy, for ambiguous loss, you need a stress-based model. That this is very stressful, and the symptoms you see are a result of that stress of not knowing. So the culprit is in the social context, not in the psyche, which is the opposite of what we've been told, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I use that framework with the estranged parents in my practice because so many of them feel so ashamed and defective, and I talk about it as being more of a social phenomenon that
Yes.
that makes them vulnerable to this. Yeah.
And I think the social phenomenon is fed by our focus on happiness and individualism.
Yeah.
You know, I certainly would tell them that so that they can see the larger context of where this is happening. I'm not sure it's going to change overnight.
No.
Um,
That's some pretty big forces, but
yeah, so the context will remain. But then that's what you're talking about. How to live in a situation over which you have no control, meaning the larger context.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, lovely. Well, this has been great, Pauline. Such an honor and a pleasure to meet you. And I loved your book, The Myth of Closure. I encourage anybody who's listening to read it. There's so much great value and wisdom in it. And I feel like you're such a great. I think it's in Japan. They talk about people being a national resource. I think that's the term. You know, sort of somebody who is just as an individual brings so much value to the culture and society. And I think you're very much that person. So really appreciate and I'm honored that you took the time to speak with me. And I know it's going to be very helpful to the people that I work with. So thank you so much. And we'll stay in touch.
You're very welcome. Thank you. And I must say this, I've learned as much from the people of Japan, Australia, Kosovo, China, around the world as they have taught, as I have helped them, if I have helped them. I've learned as much from them.
I could imagine. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.